communicate until she was 14 years old. She didn't have a formal communication in place until then, system in place until then. So if you have a student like Carly, who's flapping all the time, who is nonverbal, who may engage in some self-injurious behavior, what do you automatically think about their cognitive abilities? That she's probably pretty impacted. Instead of thinking, oh my goodness, think of what this girl was taking in the first 14 years of her life, because when she turned 14, that's when they figured out that she could type. She could type. Think of the literacy skills that she was just absorbing because she was never specifically taught those skills. She was soaking that up from her environment. So the cognitive impact there, she's probably brighter than a lot of us because she was able to take that and run with it. So spectrum disorder in each of these different areas, and it's going to be very different, which kind of makes it hard. And that's why we have evidence-based practices, because these are strategies that are research supported, that work for our students, even though no child is going to be exactly like another child. So, some of the communication concerns of students with autism.
We could probably go pretty quick through this.
Yeah. Nonverbal echolalia. Is everybody familiar with echolalia? Repeating back of what they say. Immature rhythm, nonverbal cues, behavioral concerns, inattentive, overstimulated, self-stimulatory behaviors, self-injurious behaviors, rigidity, stubbornness, routinized. Anybody work with a student who is very routine bound? Yes. What happens when that routine is blown out of the water? Self-regulation issues, absolutely. How about aggression, hitting? Are any of you working with some students that have some pretty significant behavioral challenges right now? Yes. Okay, so we'll have some fun stuff to talk about. Social concerns, we've hit social a lot already. Withdrawal, isolated. There's sometimes a breakdown expressing emotions or understanding emotions of others. That reciprocal interaction, that back and forth is oftentimes very, very hard for students with autism. And then that impacts their ability to have friends and those peer interactions. Sensory. Like I said, I still have yet to meet a student that has autism that doesn't have some level of sensory needs. Mm-hmm. Just talked about cognitive differences. And then this is just a new little table for your information that talks about the differences between the old DSM and the new DSM-5. So when they went to a spectrum disorder diagnosis, what they did is they removed childhood disintegrative disorder because they could actually find the genetic linkage for childhood disintegrative disorder. And this is a very scary disorder. It affects primarily males, and they have a period of typical development between 2 and 9 years old, and then they lose skills. And so it's a really scary one, but they have been able to identify a genetic cause for that, and so that's why it was removed from the DSM and is now a medical diagnosis. The same with Rett's disorder. Rett's disorder primarily affects and impacts females. However, there have been a few males that have been identified as having the gene and diagnosed with Rett's disorder. But because they have identified the gene, it's the MCEPP 20-something gene, they can remove that from the DSM, and it is also now a medical diagnosis. And so we're truly left with the spectrum disorders. So when they now diagnose, they diagnosed based on level of support or severity, the way that it's called severity criteria. So it's based on how much support a student would need to be successful. So level 1 is a student needs certain supports in communication and behavior. And as you go up the levels, the student needs more support. And so a level 3 student looks vastly different and needs more supports across the board than a level 2 or a level 1 student. And so this is a huge huge thing for the world of autism because there's concerns that children will be losing services because they may have had a different diagnosis like that PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. Where does that fit into this, and how does that correlate to what level a student needs? Luckily, in the school system, they just have to qualify to receive services for an autism spectrum disorder. So in the school system, we're not going to see as many changes, but it impacts outside of school. It impacts when the student leaves school, and it impacts what services are available in the community that a child could qualify for.
And I'm willing to bet that we're going to see it impact school, because a parent is going to come in and say,
with a new
I'm level
diagnosis.
3, or I'm level 2, or I'm level 1, and wait, I require substantial support. You know, all this, we know that that ripple is going to come. Now, part of what concerns me in this room is that we can't tease out comorbid disorders, right? They're comorbid. They impact one another. We can't treat these kids as only deaf. We can't treat them as only having autism. But if deafness is what's impacting, how do you decide, is that a level 1 with deafness? Is that a level 3 with deafness? But if he wasn't deaf, he'd be a level. So just understand that this is the new diagnostic criteria. Again, no answers, but being informed of those changes and really just focusing in on individual student needs is
Versus
really where
a
we
label.
need to go. Versus
Because
a label.
the label should not drive the services and supports that a student would benefit from. And so that's what we always need to be going back to, is being child-centered, child-focused, and identifying the supports and systems that we need to put in place to help a student be successful, as opposed to the label or the category that they receive services under. So, how do I best support a student with autism? We know that there's not one catch-all intervention or strategy that's going to work. First of all, we need to provide services using an eclectic model, using evidence-based practices that focus in on supporting behavior, that teach communication. Because we know that our students, guess what? If they don't have a formal system to communicate, how are they going to communicate? What are they going to use? Their behavior, absolutely. And so that's why it's really important that we take a look at that behavior, identify a function. Why are they engaging in their behavior? What are they getting out of it? Identifying a communication system to put in place, because once we do that, most likely we're going to see a decrease in behavior. And then we're also going to have to address those sensory and social needs. And once we've done all of that, then we can begin focusing on academics. But until we get the communication and the behavior supports in place, we're probably not going to get too far with our academics. Does that make sense?
Sometimes I think the hardest part for us is slowing down, or taking what we view as a step back.
And peeling back the banana.
We've tried, I have been signing with them, and I've been doing these things, and they're just not working, but I'm not willing to throw that into the air and step back and start at ground zero and then build back up. And sometimes that's the best approach to take. Because if you don't get, and Stacy and I said this last year, you all may remember, that you have to get behavior under control. You have to at least have compliance in order to then teach language and be able to access language. And so you can't address just one or just the other. You have to address them together, and you really have to look at, does anybody remember our comment last year? It's probably it's my soapbox, big, huge one, this tall, about salience. Does anybody remember that whole concept we talked about last year? Okay, it's okay, I'm not testing you, it's all right.
She'll repeat
Salience
it.
Is probably one of our most misunderstood concepts in our field. And salience is about whether a message sticks with us or whether a message goes away. So in the field of autism, how do we typically, if you see a kid that's not verbal with autism, how do they tend to communicate? Behavior, you've already said that one, but then what system do they use? Pictures. And let me tell you why they use pictures. because that picture stays there.
It's concrete.
It doesn't go away. I say to you, I want water, and then I can keep holding it there, and that's not going away. This is what I need you to do right now. It's staying there. You don't have to hold that in your memory bank. You don't have to activate a folder in your brain. You don't have to cognitively hold that. What happens when we speak? It goes away.
It's transient.
It was there and it's gone, right? It leaves. It is not salient. So here's the issue. We are deaf educators. What's our first modality we think of when oral doesn't work?
It's transient for our kiddos on the spectrum.
It's no more salient than a spoken word. You sign it,
It's gone.
it's gone. And so when we say things like using pictures with kids with autism works, I think what happens is in deaf ed, we see that as a step backward. Like, oh, we're going down to pictures. Oh, down to pictures. Well, you all know this. You had to pass those silly sign tests, didn't you? This is just as complex as oral language, but it's also just as salient. And so if we have to, if a kid requires it, being as salient as possible is very useful. In deaf ed, we have long done this. We make our messages salient, the things we really want them to get, but our kids with autism or other complex cognitive disorders also need salience for supports throughout their day. Make sense? Big soapbox, I love it, adopt it. I share with all. It's almost break time. Oh, this is me, sorry. You all came to behavior training last year, or several of you did. In the 5 minutes before we go to break, right? 5 minutes? Are we 5:15? 5:10? Perfect. And then 5 to 10 minutes before we go to break. We know that behavior, you all are here. You're on behavior teams. Behavior is happening at a very high rate in your classrooms, correct? Yes. You're concerned about some students that you're working with. You've called in help. You're trying. You're trying to figure out the puzzle. Some of you might have tried some of the evidence-based strategies that we talked about last year. I'm hoping. We talked about last year some antecedent-based interventions. We talked briefly about functional communication training, using stimuli that are familiar to a learner, using errorless learning. I'm clicking the wrong computer again.
I'll move you.
Will you click it? Thanks.
I clicked.
We talked about behavioral interventions, using discrete trial training, shaping behaviors and language, doing generalization training, and doing task analysis. You don't have to remember it all. Again, I'm not going to test anybody. We talked about peer-mediated instruction and using peers, different ways to do video modeling, and different video supports, right? Visual supports. So, in the next 10 minutes, I want you all to gather. How many of you are here as teams? Probably most of you, right? So if you can gather with your team, we're kind of going to do a similar activity to what we did last year. This may be the same student. This may be a different student, a new concern. But I want you to gather, because we're teachers, gather at your paper. Tell us about the student that you're concerned about. Did you try any of these things? Did they work or not work?
What was effective?
And then we will go around the room again and we will see if maybe the new interventions that we're going to talk about today may be impactful for your students. So tell us about your student, tell us their age, give us some characteristics of your student, and then tell us some interventions that you've tried. Have they worked, have they not worked? And we'll go from there. Sound good?
And we'll come around and bring you markers.
10 minutes, then we get break.